I'm going to talk about Christianity and Western civilization. A couple of preliminaries. First of all, Western civilization or Western culture. That seems like a pretty good phrase, pretty good term. We can talk about that easily. But I wonder if my title reflects some prejudice or some bigotry. I didn't think that when we were picking titles for this, but 2 weeks ago, I read in the Washington Post, a column by Eugene Robinson. He says, today's white supremacism tends to shy away from overtly racist terminology. Listen instead for words such as culture and civilization. I didn't know I was bigoted and racist just because I like the words culture and civilization. JP and I teach a Doctor of Ministry track together, engaging mind and culture, and we didn't know the whole track. And there's a couple of graduates of that here among us. We didn't know it was racist. Well, I don't think it is. First of all, we know pretty well what those words mean, even though we can't define them in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. But we know how to use the term culture and what we're referring to. And same with civilization. It seems to me the only reason to say we shouldn't use those terms or to attribute the use of those terms to racist ideology is if you're a cultural relativist. There we go. A cultural relativist says you can't make comparisons between different cultures. Every culture validates itself, and so you can't compare one to another. But who really believes that? Who doesn't believe there are differences of value from one culture to another? I don't know if that's Eugene Robinson's view, but it's a view that I think we should reject. The only reason I can see why you wouldn't use terms like culture and civilization is because of a relativist ideology. Now, I want to assure you that what I am about to say, I do not deny that contributions to Western civilization or human flourishing have been made by cultures outside of the North Atlantic culture, outside of Western civilization in general. Surely they have, and it's not my intent to minimize that. Nor is it my intent to deny there have been failures of the West. That is, we do have a history of witch hunts, inquisitions, crusades, wars of religion. I do think that the deleterious effects of those things have been greatly exaggerated in popular minds, but they're negative effects that we have to deal with. We also don't want to deny that there have been setbacks. There have been climate changes that have affected civilization. The Black Death wiped out somewhere between a third and half of the population of Europe in the 1300s to 1500s. I don't deny that. Nevertheless, my thesis is, if it comes up, that Christianity contributes to human flourishing. My claim really is that the great majority of factors that yielded unprecedented human flourishing in Western civilization are due directly or indirectly to Christianity. Or to say it differently, the Christian worldview, informed by the Bible and by Christian theology, has implications which have done more to contribute to human flourishing than any other culture, any other religion, any other ideology in the history of the world. Now, my claim is relatively modest. I'm not claiming that I can argue conclusively that Christianity is responsible for human flourishing. I don't think we can make conclusive arguments from history. But I do want to suggest that there are a number of lines of evidence taken together so that the preponderance of the evidence suggests that Christianity has had a major influence in the factors that allow for human flourishing that we see in Western civilization today. So it's a somewhat modest claim. It's not a philosophically or logically compelling claim, but it is a claim that's interesting and I believe supported by a preponderance of the evidence. Now, many people would deny that religion has anything to do with culture. I have several books on culture, and only one of them gives any attention at all, and that only in one chapter, to religious influences on culture. It just happens that many sociologists are atheists. In fact, at one point, InterVarsity did a study, and the discipline in the universities where the professors had the highest percentage of atheists was sociology. Now, if someone doesn't believe that religion means anything, that it's empty talk about nothing, they're not going to be interested in the influences of religion in the development of culture. So a lot of studies, a lot of people just are not interested. They think religion has nothing to do with it. And we even see this today when people refuse to consider the role of Islam in radical Islamic terrorism. What's the religious contributions? If we don't understand the religious nature of the world around us, we're going to be at a loss. In fact, Harvard University has abolished their Department of Religious Studies because religion really has no bearing on the modern world. After 9/11, some of the Harvard faculty decided we really need to have a Department of Religious Studies. Our students need to understand something about Islam and why out of Islam there grew this terroristic impulse. And other scholars at Harvard, like Steven Pinker, a famous computer scientist and linguist, said, no, absolutely not. We can't devote 4 years of a student's life to majoring in something that doesn't mean anything. But it's worse than that. Christopher Hitchens, whose name you might know, has said this: the Bible may indeed contain a warrant for trafficking in humans, for ethnic cleansing, for slavery, for bride price, and for indiscriminate massacre. But we're not honored by any of that because the Bible was put together by crude, uncultured human mammals. Violent, irrational, intolerant, allied to racism and tribalism and bigotry, invested in ignorance and hostile to free inquiry, contemptuous of women and coercive to children, organized religion has a great deal on its conscience. Another objection here. Daniel Dennett, one of the new atheists who has discovered they can make a lot of money by selling atheist apologetics. Dennett has said, I think there are no forces on this planet more dangerous to us all than the fanaticisms of fundamentalism of all the species: Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, as well as countless smaller infections. And finally, Richard Dawkins: the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it. Petty, unjust, unforgiving, control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynist, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, maniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. So how do you really feel, Richard? Now, I have two purposes in what I'm doing this morning. First is negative. I want to show that the critics are wrong. I want to show you that Christianity in particular has had extremely positive influences in Western civilization. But positively, I want to show you that those positive influences are things that we can be, in a sense, proud of. We don't have to be ashamed of our Western culture, of Western civilization. And we can acknowledge that much of the benefits of the liberty that we enjoy today, much of the benefits of the factors that enable us to flourish as humans, are traceable directly or indirectly to Christianity. That may sound non-politically correct, so be it, but this is another avenue of discussion. I love to get in philosophical debates with people where we parse the logic and we refer to Aquinas and Descartes, but most people are not like that. And oftentimes, just by talking about culture, about our history, we can come to a point where they say, yeah, you know, you may be right. Maybe I ought to look into this more. Okay, so here's the background. There's Christian faith in reason, and without that, we wouldn't have Western civilization. Now, the Greeks believed in reason. Who we believe is the very first philosopher, a guy named Thales, well before Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. Thales applied reason to say something about eclipses, about cycles of weather, and about a coming famine that would strike the olive oil production, and so on. but they never took that reason and applied it in the way that it was pushed forward after Christianity became the official religion of the empire after Constantine. We believe as Christians that God is a rational person. Our God is a God of order. Thales stepped outside of the contemporary Greek religion of his day, where the fickle gods on top of Mount Olympus with their whims and jealousies controlled everything that went on. And he said, no, there's order, there's regularity. The gods really don't matter. That didn't get very far in ancient Greece. But that's the foundational belief of Judaism and Christianity. Our God is a God of order. And human beings made in God's image are also rational people, designed by our Creator to see, to discover, to seek out the order in the world around us. Christian faith in the power of reason. Second, we have Christian faith in progress. The cultural mandate, theologians have called it in Genesis 1 and 2, be fruitful, multiply, have dominion, rule over, subdue. In the garden to Adam, guard the garden and keep the garden. This cultural mandate implies that we must use our reason and that order in the world is discoverable by us because God put it there. And the fact that we can have dominion to rule over, to guard the garden and so on, implies that progress is possible. History is not cyclical, constantly repeating itself. History is directional, moving towards a goal. No less than St. Augustine, and by the way, for some of my students, that's a correct pronunciation, not Augustine. Save Augustine for those who really love Britain. We're Augustinians. So Augustine has said this: has not the genius of man invented and applied countless astonishing arts? Partly the result of necessity, but partly the result of exuberant invention. So that this vigor of mind betokens an inexhaustible wealth in human nature, which can invent, learn, or employ such arts, and so on. Augustine celebrated the progress that had been made, and compared to our day, the progress to his point, it was very small. But he still celebrated that as a gift of God when humans use their God-given abilities of reason. Third, Christian faith in freedom. Now, I'm not going to debate whether we ought to understand freedom in a compatibilist or libertarian sense. All of us believe that God has given us a limited amount of freedom. God is still sovereign, but he grants human beings a limited amount of free will. Impersonal fate is not in control. Now, freedom implies a right to choose. As the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre would say, we are condemned to be free. We're radically free, and that's a terrible burden on us. But most of us think the ability to choose is a good thing. We're free to obey God or to rebel. We're free to choose a wise or a foolish course of action. We're free to eat that second piece of pie or reject it. We're free to actually follow through on our intentions and go to the gym, which I haven't done in quite some time. But we're free. And again, St. Augustine said, God knows all things. He's not denying that God knows what will happen in the future, what we will choose. But he says that doesn't determine it. He says, we do by our free will whatsoever we do because we will it. The Christian belief in freedom has implications. It implies the right to enjoy the fruits of our labor, the right to choose our path, our vocation, the right to choose where to travel. So belief in reason, progress, and freedom are the background for all the developments that I see happening in Western culture over history that have contributed to human flourishing. Now, I'm going to give you a number of different illustrations of this, sort of a hodgepodge, if you will. I don't think these are linked in any logical way. They're just different evidences of the contribution of Christianity. Let me begin with capitalism. The big idea of capitalism is that we use what we own to produce more. Capitalism didn't begin, as Max Weber thought, with Puritanism. It actually began with the monastic estates in Italy in the 9th century. As these monasteries grew larger and larger, they developed some industries of their own, notably in Tuscany and winemaking and so on. And it spread from there to the north. The idea was private ownership. The means of production were not controlled by the state. The monasteries were not a command economy where some higher power developed a 5-year plan, and we know how well that worked for Stalin and for Mao. Rather, it was a free economy. Relatively free markets, even in the 9th century, so the monks could sell what they made, and then investment in anticipation of future returns. The monks might have realized that a particular kind of vine produced an especially delicious kind of wine, but it takes several years for the wines to produce the right kind of grapes, so they would invest anticipating future returns, even though it costs them today to plant those vines. You see, investment in anticipation of future returns. Now, the conditions that were required for this, as I said, first of all, a free, not a command economy. But then there needed to be a cash system and not simply a barter system. As the monastic estates grew and produced more and more, they weren't able to barter with everybody who came to them. They had to have some means of exchange that wasn't a cow for a vat of wine. And so coinage was invented. A cash system of the economy really began in the 9th century. And then credit and banks. If you want to buy a whole lot of vines this year so you can have good wine 3 years from now, or you want to add a few cows to your herd so you can produce more cheese to sell next fall, you've got to have the money from somewhere. And so a banking system was invented that would loan money at interest. Now, this caused problems initially, because the theory at this time was that nobody could charge interest. That's why all the bankers up through about the 10th century were Jews. They didn't mind charging interest. Christians were not supposed to do that. But as the need for credit became evident, as these monastic estates grew, and soon corporations divorced from the monastic estates developed, the need for credit showed that they ought to rethink what they meant about charging interest and extending credit. And they found inspiration in parables of Jesus, such as the parable of the talents. So it didn't seem that charging a reasonable amount of interest was necessarily sinful. And we have the birth of our banking system grounded in a theological understanding that we should invest in our cattle, we should invest in our farm, we should invest in our vines, seeking future returns so that we have for our own consumption, but we also have enough to share with others. Credit and interest at a reasonable level, not usurious interest, but a reasonable amount of interest, became theologically acceptable. And I think this is probably I think this is the correct reading of a biblical system of economics. If you read the Old Testament, what we have in the Old Testament is not a socialistic system at all. Some people think that the year of Jubilee or the sabbatical years imply a socialistic system where everybody shares everything. That's not what it was. The year of Jubilee, the means of acquiring wealth was redistributed. Wealth itself was not. It was the means of acquiring wealth, the land in an agrarian economy, returned to its dynastic owner. But the wealth was retained by the owner who had it at the time the year of Jubilee came. So it seems that a correct biblical theology does not condemn profit, investment, credit, interest. And this theology developed, and the results were economic freedom. No longer were people tied to the wages that the feudal lord would pay, or in cities that the city council decreed. It led to vastly improved standards of living. The standard of living in Europe rose dramatically between about 800 and 1300 compared to the rest of the world. And then after the Industrial Revolution, it took off phenomenally. But With most of these advances, there's a potential downside. Just as with human freedom, there's a possibility of sin. So with economic freedom, there's a possibility of greed and abuse. But because, as Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you, there will always be those who, for one reason or another, some intentional and some that people have no control over, they are poor. We also saw developing about this time an emphasis on charitable giving. Just recently, I checked the Chronicle of Philanthropy. 75% of religious Christians give to charity. 75%. The average of the entire country is 56%. Which means there's groups in the country that give next to nothing to bring the average down from 75 to 56%. It's true that charitable giving among believers is higher than among any other group. We recognize some of the dangers of capitalism, but the fruits of it are undeniable. A second area is education. The first schools that we have in Christendom were schools associated with cathedrals or monasteries designed to train priests. And so in the large cities of Europe, cathedral schools developed, and they were there to train new priests. But somewhere along the line, and it's not clear exactly where, the belief arose that the peasants deserve an education as well. They ought to be able to think as critically as the priests. They ought to be able to understand the theological claims being made by the priests. And so we ought to teach them as well. And so in Europe, we have the move from cathedral schools and monasteries to scholia, or schools designed to teach ordinary people. They needed to learn things like writing so they could keep track of their economic affairs. They needed to learn mathematics, at least basic arithmetic, so they could do the math of buying and selling. And universities then arose. And this, as we see references to the medieval schools in the philosophers and theologians of the day, the philosophers were theologians, they ground this in the fact that the image of God resides in the peasant as well as the priest and the pope. And if knowledge is a good thing for the pope and for the priest, it's a good thing for the peasant. And so we ought to educate them. We have the medieval universities then arising. The first university was probably Bologna, followed very closely by Paris and Oxford. The Italians will always claim priority here. By the middle of the 10th century, both in Paris and Bologna, we have universities. Very shortly after 1100, it shows up at Oxford and Cambridge. The universities were divided into faculties of theology and faculties of art. Students would begin in the faculty of art, and only after they graduated from the faculty of the arts could they go on to theology, and not all of them would. And we have the 7 liberal arts and the 3 philosophies. I won't bore you with that. Natural philosophy, though, the arts faculties were subject to the theology faculty. Theology, remember, was the queen of the sciences. Now, maybe the queen couldn't get out of her bed without the help of the handmaid, science, but theology was the queen. And when it came to the New World, as you know, the great American universities, the great Ivy League universities, with the exception of Cornell, were all chartered as religious institutions. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Penn. They were religious institutions because the idea was religion should be the cornerstone and the ultimate judge of everything that was taught. That changed, as we know, but the initial motivation here was a religious motivation to educate people made in the image of God. Okay? Literacy. In the early medieval period, the era of serfdom and feudal Europe, most of the serfs were not literate. In fact, most of the knights were not literate. And in fact, most of the feudal lords were not literate. They relied on priests or someone else who might have been somehow educated to learn how to read, but literacy began to grow as feudal Europe broke down. People began moving into villages, which were growing into cities. And it occurred to many in the church that Christianity is a text-based religion. From Judaism was received the idea that we should reverence the very letters of the text. And of course, Jesus said, not one yod, not one iota will depart from the law. So there was reverence not just for the general story, but for the sentences and the words and the letters. And copying of the scripture was a very exact art. If a copy was found to have an error, it would be destroyed. Reverence for the text. But that implies that there's a reverence for learning to read the text. And so the universities were devoted as well to spreading literacy, not just to the priests, but to ordinary people, and teaching them to teach those who could not come to the scholia how to read themselves. Now, in the Reformation era, you recall, of course, that Martin Luther and John Calvin taught that we are all priests, the priesthood of the believer. This made it even more important that lay people in the church understand how to read, because we're priests. We don't depend on the magisterium, on the teaching authority of the church. We depend upon each person's reading Scripture, being illumined by the Holy Spirit in that reading. So there was an even stronger emphasis on learning in the Reformation period in Northern Europe and in the United States. Now, another area is human rights and liberty. And I don't know if Frank's going to say something about that this afternoon. Slavery, of course, has been around for about as long as history has any records. Now, we can argue that maybe the slavery in ancient Greece or ancient Rome were a little different than slavery in the South. I'm not interested in that. Slavery is an abomination. No human should own another human. But slavery was abolished by the 10th century throughout Europe. By the middle of the 900s, there's no slavery in Europe. Why? We can call it the logic of the Eucharist. If the church baptizes slaves, which it did, and admits them to the celebration of the Eucharist, then the master sitting in the pew beside the slave cannot say, I'm better, I deserve to own him. If God accepts him through baptism and in the celebration of the Mass, I must accept him. And this is clearly very solidly New Testament teaching. One scholar has said economics was not the decisive factor in the abolition of slavery in Europe. Slavery ended in Europe only because the church extended the sacraments to all slaves and then banned slavery. The logic of the Eucharist. Bishop Agobard of Lyon, and there should be an S on Lyon, city in France, about 820, he said, all men are brothers. All invoke the same Father, God, the slave and the master, the poor man and the rich man, the ignorant and the learned, the weak and the strong. There's no slave or free, but in all things and always there is Christ. That's very Pauline, isn't it? That's very New Testament. And implementing that and letting that soak into their souls led to the abolition of slavery by the 10th century in Europe. Now, unfortunately, we know that slavery didn't end then. It had to be abolished all over again in the New World. In the 19th century, the slave trade, and some in South America, more in the Caribbean and North America, the slave trade from Africa had to be confronted. And you will find people today who say it's the Enlightenment thinkers that brought the end to slavery in the New World. Let me digress here for a moment. A lot of criticism of certain ways of thinking, and in fact, the way that many of us do apologetics, says, well, that's modernist thinking. And modernist thinking has infected the church. And we should do away with that. We're all postmodern now, and on and on. I think what is usually criticized by people when they criticize, quote, modernism, is really an Enlightenment mentality that says we can do without God, man is the measure of all things, What we can know is all that there is to know, and we can know it. We don't need God. We don't need revelation. There is no God. There is no revelation. And we find this in the French Revolution, for example, which was the bloodiest revolution in Western civilization. It's the Enlightenment that is criticized. And we can be critical of the Enlightenment without being critical of modernity. But the claim is made, and I'll see this a little later on, that modernity is or the Enlightenment is what's responsible for the strengths of Western civilization. But look at this. Enlightenment thinkers largely supported slavery for economic reasons. I'm talking now about the 18th, 19th centuries. People like Hobbes, John Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Mirabeau, and others in their writings supported slavery. It was not the Enlightenment thinkers, although there were a few. It was not primarily Enlightenment thinkers that rejected slavery. It was a religious rejection. Abolitionism was a Christian movement, right? It was Quaker groups in England and other religious groups that were the soul of the abolitionist movement. And soon, rights were extended to women and to children, child labor laws, women's suffrage. Susan B. Anthony, for example, an abolitionist, involved with the Christian Women's Temperance Union, strong proponent of women's suffrage, came out of her Christian convictions, and others who worked with her. So I think we can say that human rights and liberty that we enjoy in the Western world have their roots in a Christian view of the individual, made in the image of God, granted freedom, which entails a right to choose for all. Christianity is the source of the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. Modern science. Let's see, JP talked some about this. Both he and I have taught philosophy of science for a number of years. Both of us have written on it. I didn't know he was writing on it, a book on it. He just said he was a few minutes ago. I am as well. I'm not going to get into it very deeply. Science is different from technology. Many cultures invented or discovered technology. For example, China, gunpowder, Egypt. We're still not entirely sure how they managed to move those massive stones that comprise the pyramids and how they got them aligned so precisely. Syracuse, Archimedes invented an Archimedean screw, which is designed to draw water from a lower stream up over a bank into an irrigation canal. It was widely used in Europe along the Nile, in Egypt along the Nile. Iron, the Hittite Empire, 1500 BC. The Hittites had been able to smelt iron, and that's why the Hittites were so strong. Their iron swords would wipe out the bronze swords of their opponents. Between 800 and 1000 AD, there was a strong iron industry in China, until the Ming Dynasty noticed that the peasants who were smelting iron were getting rich, and so they nationalized the iron smelting industry in China, and that was pretty much the end of it from about 1080 on in the history of China. So technology has been around. Technology never led to science except in one place. Science as a disciplined approach. By the way, JP's right. There is not a single thing that's science. There's not a single scientific method. There's many different methodologies and many different approaches to different aspects of nature. That's fine, but I'm going to talk about science in general, okay? He's not in the room, so I can dismiss him. Science as a disciplined approach to the study of the natural world, seeking explanations which involve cause and effect. That approach arose only once in the history of the world, and only in Europe. Years ago, when I first started reading philosophy of science, I thought, well, I'm not sure. Maybe it's a historical accident. Maybe science arose in Europe, but it might have arisen somewhere else. I'm convinced today that that's not correct. I'm convinced that Christianity has more to do with the rise of science than most scientists realize. Edward Grant in a great study, The Foundations of Science in the Middle Ages, has said this: "It is indisputable that modern science emerged in the 17th century in Western Europe and nowhere else." And Rodney Stark says, who's a professor at Baylor, says the crucial question is why? Why did it arise in Western Europe and nowhere else? My answer to this is as brief as it is unoriginal. Christianity. Christianity depicted God as a rational, responsive, dependable, and omnipotent being, and the universe as his personal creation, thus having a rational, lawful, stable structure awaiting human comprehension. Nowhere else do we have this conception of God coupled with an understanding of human beings made in God's image with the cultural mandate to use our rationality to study the world. That combination is Christian. Now, we often talk about the scientific revolution, and that's what Stark and Grant are referring to in about the 17th century. Really, there was no real revolution. There was a lot of scientific progress throughout all of Western Europe, through the early medieval and late medieval period, and up until the Renaissance period of the rise of modern science. The idea was that God has given us the duty to understand his world. Outside of the Christian scholarship community, people said, well, we read Aristotle. Now, Aristotle is massively boring and massively brilliant. If you've read Aristotle, you know. He wrote about everything, and he wrote incredibly insightfully. And people said, man, I can't compete with Aristotle. So they read Aristotle, they taught Aristotle, Aristotle was it. But in the 12th century, we come to a guy named Roger Bacon, a monk, and he said, wait a minute. God's given us intellects. We shouldn't accept Aristotle just on faith. We have the duty to test him to see if he's right. He called this the first prerogative of the scientist, the prerogative to do experiments to test received knowledge. But Bacon went one step further. Bacon said we have the prerogative of experimentation to extend knowledge. We can do experiments to test things that Aristotle didn't know anything about and extend our knowledge. And both of these prerogatives come from the fact that God has made us and given us this mandate. Recently, well, 1960, that's recently for me, a Nobel laureate physicist named Eugene Wigner wrote an article that's become rather famous. And it was called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. Wigner's argument is, well, he says at the end, this effectiveness of mathematics in describing the natural world is a gift we neither understand nor deserve. A gift implies a giver, doesn't it? I don't know anything about Wigner's personal faith, but he thought the fact that we can use mathematics to describe the world was amazing. We don't understand why it works, we don't deserve it. More recently, a scholar at Hebrew University in Tel Aviv, the Tel Aviv branch, Mark Steiner, has written a book called The Applicability of Mathematics as a Philosophical Problem. Steiner says he's an agnostic. But we can not only use mathematics to describe the world, we use mathematics to discover the world. Think about this. As JP said, mathematics is just an a priori invention of our intuition and our imagination. I was a math minor. The weirdest course I ever took in my life was abstract algebra. We just walk in and invent algebraic systems and have for the fun of it. Write our axioms, derive theorems. Abstract, didn't have anything to do with anything, but it was fun, just intellectual exercise. Mathematicians would do the pure math and then they'd put it on the shelf and go on to something else. And especially in the era of the development of quantum physics in the teens and 20s, 19-teens, 1920s, the physicists would come up with vast reams of statistics. And they didn't know how mathematically to deal with these statistics, so they went to the pure mathematicians who said, hey, you know, I think I got something on my shelf back here. I'm paraphrasing. And they'd pull off some mathematical formalism, and they'd say, try this. The physicists would use the mathematics and say, it works. But there's this term in your equation out here that doesn't have anything to do with what I'm studying. If this part describes a particular, say a quark, a charm quark, maybe this describes a top quark. And they go look, and there it was. Now, this is mathematics that was designed for no purpose at all, that turns out to be useful in discovering things about the world. Mathematics lets us describe and discover the world. That is totally inexplicable on a naturalistic assumption, but it's something we would expect in a theistic worldview. Mark Steiner ends his book by saying it's undeniable that we live in a user-friendly universe. Who made it that way? So the rise of mathematics, and I'm not denying that there were mathematical advances in Islamic civilizations, especially Persia and what's today Iraq. There are some great mathematicians that have come out of India and Hindu tradition. But the mathematics that enables us to do special and general relativity, quantum mechanics, comes out of Western Europe, grounded in a particular belief that the universe is a certain way, and this gift of intuition is applicable. Now, the scientific revolution, so to speak, in the 17th century, many of the main figures were clergymen, and many others had evident faith. I put question marks beside some of them. For example, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for being a heretic. I'm not really sure about Marco Polo, Christian Huygens. Isaac Newton was an Arian. He wrote more Unitarian biblical studies than he did mathematics or physics. But these men all had some kind of faith in God, and these are the primary figures in the rise of modern science in the 17th century. So, what can we conclude then about science? Both the impulse to study and the tools with which to study were grounded in a Christian worldview, at least indirectly, and for many of these men directly. But let me just briefly mention my favorite hero in modern science is Johannes Kepler, a great mathematician and astronomer. And he kept voluminous diaries. And reading his diaries is really fun. When he's working on trying to reduce all of the astronomical data he got from a Danish astronomer, Tycho Brahe, he's trying to reduce it mathematically to describe the orbits of the planets. And he talks about how feverishly he works at this. And when he finally discovers his laws of planetary motion, elliptical orbits, he gets so excited, he says, I've worked at this feverishly. God has led me to discover this, and I praise him for it. And if I discovered it, great. If nobody believes me, fine. God wanted me to discover this. And he's so excited about it. Alfred North Whitehead, who was not a believer and not very friendly to Christianity, said this in his Lowell lecture at Harvard: when we compare the tone of thought in Europe with the attitude of other civilizations when left to themselves, there seems to be but one source of its origin. This is a scientific mentality he's talking about. It must come from the medieval insistence on the rationality of God, conceived as with the personal energy of Jehovah, and with the rationality, the personal energy and the rationality of a Greek philosopher. What I mean is the impress on the European mind rising from the unquestioned faith of centuries. By this I mean the instinctive tone of thought and not a mere creed of words. In other words, the influence of the Christian worldview affected the approach, the mentality, the outlook of people who themselves were not deeply committed to a creed. And I think Whitehead is right. Science and all the advantages that we enjoy today that have derived from science, directly and indirectly attributable to Christianity. Another area. Doug is going to talk more about art this afternoon, but we have art, beauty, and architecture. The invention of Gothic architecture and the cross-ribbed arches which allow ceilings to soar, walls become much higher, support pillars on the side much thinner so the windows can be bigger. This is Chartres Cathedral in France, a gorgeous, gorgeous building. By the way, Chartres, these are the flying buttresses that support the walls. These were invented by Abbot Suger at Cathedral Saint-Denis, just north of Paris. These are at Chartres. I love the cathedral charts because in the records, the people, this is in the 1100s, the villagers would come home after working in the fields all day, and the stonemasons would have cut stone. And after working in the fields all day, the villagers would come home and they would set the stones where the masons had cut them to go. And they were doing it, as they say, so they can build a cathedral for the glory of God in their village. Some of these cathedrals, yes, were built with indulgences, money, and so on. Many of them were built because people wanted to do something to glorify God. Probably the grandest is the jewel of La Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, that gorgeous little chapel built by St. Louis, Louis IX, to house relics brought back after the Sixth Crusade. Over 1,100 stained glass windows. Music. Many cultures have music. I can't claim that's Christian. But we certainly see in the Old Testament the importance of music. And Martin Luther, in a quote that a friend of mine just shared with me a couple days ago, Luther said, "The man who sings prays twice. Once with his voice and once with the music, he's praying." This is a medieval manuscript, and what it shows is polyphonic, not monophonic, but polyphonic music where two voices could sing harmony. We've all heard Gregorian chants where everybody sings the same notes. Pretty soon they realize we can sing harmony, and this is even better for glorifying God. The greatest composer of them all, in my view, Johann Sebastian Bach, would often write in the margins of his compositions initials, "To God alone be glory," "Thank you, Jesus," things like that. He was worshiping God by his compositions. And as I was working on this PowerPoint a few days ago, I was playing his B minor Mass and had to stop and listen to it. And since not everybody could afford an orchestra to accompany their musicians, the king of the instruments was invented, the pipe organ. And what a tragedy that churches use guitars. But I'm a fogey, right? Other forms of art. Painting. This is Frangelico, the Descent from the Cross. I can't see the date on that, but it's fairly, what this, 1434. It's still rather, looks like an icon. 200 years later, we find Rembrandt's Descent from the Cross. Moving painting where Rembrandt paints himself at the foot of the cross as one who had participated in the crucifixion of Christ, and the theological motivation there is deep. In Northern Europe, with the Dutch masters, we see not so much a repeat of religious themes, but of ordinary themes. Jan Steen's village school here looks like chaos. In fact, it's still a proverb in Holland, I understand. Somebody says, "Oh, I have a Jan Steen household," meaning it looks like my desk. It's all cluttered and messed up. Why did they do that? Because they believed that the grace of God infused the ordinary. They didn't have to paint the Madonna and Child. They didn't have to paint crucifixions to communicate a religious theme. And Rembrandt shows that in his many portraits of individuals, where he looks to get the features of the person exactly right because this man, this woman, this child was made in God's image. Sculpture, of course, Michelangelo's Pietà in St. Peter's in Rome is not only a magnificent sculpture, but deeply moving. The point here is not that there was not art, architecture, and music elsewhere. It's that the Christian motivation in Europe seems to have raised it to a higher level. More than that, it shows the Christian artists seeking beauty. Beauty was the theme that drove them. Beauty was what they were after, because beauty is a representation of God. Art as well was linked, as was science, to a growing prosperity and stability in the culture at the time, which was linked, as we saw earlier, to the growth of capitalism and economic freedom. How about missions? This is not strictly Western civilization, but it came from Western civilization. We could go back, as Thomas Cahill did in his wonderful little book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, to the monks returning from the Isles out on the west coast of Ireland and Scotland, bringing Christianity back into Europe. But how about modern missions? Medical missions throughout the world. Missions, everywhere missionaries went, they established clinics and hospitals. And even today, that goes on. In fact, you probably know that the doctor and the nurse, the American doctor and nurse who became infected with Ebola in Liberia were Christian missionaries. Not just medicine, though, literacy and education. Christians would teach the people to read. If their language wasn't written, they'd reduce it to writing. And of course, we have Wycliffe Bible translators and New Tribes Mission and other organizations with linguists designed to reduce languages from spoken to written, teach people to read. Why? So they could read Scripture. What about the result of missions? A scholar at Baylor, he's still at Baylor, right? Woodbury? Is Woodbury, John Woodbury at Baylor? Okay, he may have moved on. Woodbury is misspelled. It's B-E-R-R-Y, not B-U-R-Y. I was moving too fast typing. Woodbury studied missions primarily in Africa, where he was familiar with, but then he expanded it to South America and part of South Asia. He did all kinds of mathematical analysis, trying to factor for certain other influences to show whether these influences were predominant or not. And his conclusion was areas where Protestant missionaries had a significant presence in the past are on average more economically developed today, with comparatively better health, lower infant mortality, lower corruption, greater literacy, higher educational attainment, especially for women, and more robust membership in non-governmental associations. Woodbury has published his conclusions. They've been criticized by people who initially say, oh, that can't be true. Missions can't. We know that missions are, in a sense, genocidal because they destroy cultures. But when scholars actually look at his work, they say, there's something there. There's a discernible effect of missions. Virtue is my last category here. And of course we know that Jesus is our exemplar. We ought to be like Jesus. Paul says, be a follower of me as I am of Christ. If we can let Christ be formed in us, live into his life so that he lives through us, we will be virtuous people. And the development of virtue, although it was known to Aristotle and Plato and the Stoics, it receives its strongest impetus in medieval and later Renaissance Christianity. Here's a painting by Franz Franken the Younger. It's called Man's Dilemma, the choice between vice and virtue. He understood that we always have this choice in our lives. And unlike virtually every graduation speaker in the last 40 years, we're not told to be ourselves, do what we feel like doing, do what comes naturally. We're told, develop the virtues, become virtuous people. Why? Well, as Plato and Aristotle in Greece knew, and as the Roman Stoics also knew, good people make good societies. And there is a way to be a good person. These people believed in sort of a bottom-up theory of good societies. As a person learns to develop certain virtues, intellectual and moral virtues, as we seek to become like Christ, we will be good people. We will not yield to the lesser angels of our nature. We'll follow the better angels of our nature. We'll be truth tellers. We'll be faithful. We'll be balanced between greed and poverty, and so on. And as individuals form a culture, these virtues infect the culture. And the culture rewards and punishes virtue and vice. And as a last resort, you have the government and the laws. Now, with your permission, I'm going to get political for just a minute. The progressive mentality, the political liberal mentality of our day says, no, there's no such thing as virtue. Virtue is relative to cultures, relative to traditions. What one culture might look at as a virtue, another culture looks at as a vice. One culture might bury their dead, another culture might burn their dead, a third culture might eat their dead. Look how different they are. So we can't talk about virtue. And in fact, we have, since the Enlightenment, become people who are autonomous, free from law, autonomous, self-law. So the best thing we can do is to live lives consistently with who we want to be. And that means not just in what I do, but in how I view myself. And so today, the big issues, of course, relate to gender and gender identity. And we can be whoever we want to be. We're not bound by any socially imposed gender roles. We can break out of that. So the notion that individuals develop virtues and their conscience tells them when they're violating their virtues, this is ruled out. And of course, then that's ruled out for cultures as well because of cultural relativism. And so that's why you have to have governments with all kinds of laws and all kinds of regulations, regulating everything from the top down, because somebody knows best. And they will impose their view through regulations and laws, rather than the bottom-up view that's characteristic of the Western civilization. So excuse me for that. I think that's one way to understand what's going on in our politics today. Amen. Oh, thank you. I'll take a collection afterwards. Now, in conclusion, what can unite all this together? Well, three words. Three things that were called the transcendentals by the great medieval philosophers: the good, the true, and the beautiful. God is good, God is true, God is beautiful. And we should pursue those values. So goodness we can see in capitalism and the rising standard of living. We can see it in the end of slavery, the extension of rights. We can see it in the work of missions. Truth, we see that in education. And we see that in literacy movements. The beautiful, we see that in art, music, and architecture. The good, the true, and the beautiful. These are the values that have informed Western civilization and find their strongest origin and strongest grounding in the Christian God. And Anne Applebaum, a political scientist, this is just 2 weeks ago in Washington Post, said the enlightened belief that we can know and understand reality, that we can measure it, weigh it, judge it, use reason to explain it. This Enlightenment belief underlies all of the achievements of Western civilization, from the scientific revolution to the industrial revolution to democracy itself. This is false. It just is false. Virtually all of the achievements of Western culture are due directly or indirectly to the influence of Christianity centuries before the Enlightenment. And I suppose Anne Applebaum, with her political science focus, just like Richard Dawkins with his biology focus on frogs, is ignoring history, philosophy, and theology. Rodney Stark concludes one of his books, The Victory of Reason, there are many reasons people embrace Christianity, including its capacity to sustain a deeply emotional and existentially satisfying faith. But another significant factor is its appeal to reason and the fact that it is inseparably linked to the rise of Western civilization. So, don't be ashamed to say there have been Christian influences on our culture. Admit the drawbacks, admit the failures, but point out to your conversation partner the great advantages that we enjoy, which can only be explained by the direct or indirect influence of a Christian worldview, which has produced a civilization in which, to an unprecedented degree in human history, has led to human flourishing. And I guess the pessimistic footnote is, to the degree we lose that Christian worldview, to that degree we'll lose what has made Western civilization so valuable. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. DeWeese. My name is Natasha, and I have heard that the most corrupt governments and nations in the world today are Islamic in origin. Do you have any thoughts on that statement?
That the most corrupt are Islamic?
In origin, yeah, that stem from an Islamic worldview.
I can't make that judgment. I don't know enough about that. There's an awful lot of corruption in regimes say, in Africa and in South America, which claim to be Christian, sadly. There's one of the main things that's been driving reforms in China for a long time, has been the desire to get rid of corruption. I would be tempted to say maybe the most corrupt regime in the world is North Korea, but I'm not sure about that. I would say, though, that at least from my understanding, the regimes, the governments that have done the most to weed out corruption have been those where there's been a predominantly Christian culture with a Christian worldview behind it. I think I could support that historically.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
So I have a comment and a question.
Okay.
My comment is just that I'm a really big fan of your work on the problem of evil, particularly the free process defense.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So to shamelessly plug a friend of mine named David Marshall, who has this Christ the Tau blogspot, he has a great article detailing 133 books that would evidence what you have said here in the different respects, that that Christianity leads to human flourishing.
Great.
With that being said, I would like to know what you feel are the causes of some of the widespread cultural ignorance on this point.
That article was by Marshall.
Yes, David B. Marshall.
Where is it located?
On Christ the Tau blogspot.
Okay.
It means Christ the Way. But,
Good.
yeah.
Some of you might want to check that out. That's interesting. I only gave you 5 references on the outlines. There's 133. I think ultimately the answer is sin. We are people who do not like authority over us. We want to be autonomous. We want to be self-sufficient. And even though, look, how many of you rotate your tires every 5,000 miles? How many of you change your oil? The owner's manual says to do it, but if we follow the owner's manual, we might get more life out of our car, more life out of our tires, but I don't like to be told. In my own life, I don't like to be told. And I think that as soon as a door is opened where, as JP talked about in biology, you can take God out, as soon as that is open culturally, as soon as we can ignore that, as soon as multiculturalism is set into the point where we have to downplay the achievements of the United States or Western civilization and emphasize the failures, we've allowed this to disappear from teaching. Typically, people who are atheists or agnostics don't want to teach the value of religion.
Thank you very much.
That's my view. And I could be wrong about that, but that's okay?
Seems plausible to me.
Thank you. Daryl.
Hey, Gary.
Yeah, man.
I feel like we're constantly answering this question with students as to the nature of Christian missions. And you mentioned some of the positive features, some of the positive benefits of Christian missions, but it's often portrayed as inherently colonialist, and colonialism being the biggest sin they could come up with in the academy. So how do you address kind of the negative aspect of Christian missions when someone says, well, Christian missions is inherently colonialist, but what they mean by that is it's culture stealing or culture crushing in some way?
Good question. Woodbury, in his study, distinguishes 3 groups of missionaries. The Roman Catholic missionaries who, especially the Jesuits, who really were in the forefront of moving Christianity around the world, and retained a very strong cultural allegiance to Rome, but as well were open to various accommodations with local customs and religions. The second group are Protestant state churches, which relied to their government. And third are free church Protestants. He calls them conversionary Protestantism. And the primarily good effects that he sees come from the conversionary Protestant missionaries, somewhat less so from the Jesuits, even less so from the state religions, the state-sponsored religions with their allegiance. And it seems to me that the colonial charge is best laid at the foot of these state churches. And not so much the conversionary Protestants. Hudson Taylor and Adoniram Judson and the 5 missionaries killed in Ecuador, Nate Saint and Jim Elliott, were not seeking to bring their United States government or their British government. They just wanted these people to know Christ and experience a different kind of life. The other reason is why it's charged to be colonial is a cultural relativistic view that this particular culture is good as it is. Maybe they live in the Stone Age, maybe they don't have medicine, maybe they don't have iron pots to cook with or iron machetes, but it's good as it is. And if you introduce anything in the Western world that's cultural genocide, that sometimes goes under the word colonialism. I don't think there's anything meritorious about seeking to keep people in an impoverished Stone Age state. So if somebody makes that charge, let's talk about it seriously. Let's talk about some instances, and we'll see a difference. Okay? One more.
I know an argument I hear a lot of times, just kind of in disagreement with a lot of what you're saying, is that the reason why Christianity's had that influence is because it had the money and it had the power. Especially looking at, for instance, like the Inquisition, or even thinking of Bach. The reason Bach or Mozart or some of those artists did Christian music is because that's where the money was. So if you want to be a musician making money, you're going to do it for the church. Or if you're a scientist, you're going to do it for the church because otherwise they're going to kill you or they won't fund you. And again, it's money or power, and that's the reasons. How would you reply to that?
Yeah, I think that's just wrong historically. Until Constantine made the whole empire Christian, there was a lot of Christian progress in the first 3 centuries. But it wasn't because they had power, it wasn't because they had money. Later one wonders, why did it have money? Some was due to corruption, some was due to selling indulgences and the idea that if you give to the church, you'll get a better deal in the life to come and so on. But some of it was people just wanted to give. They wanted to further the work of their local diocese or the church globally. Musicians, certainly by the time of Renaissance music, and later Renaissance, it wasn't the church really where all the money was initially, well, maybe initially, but Mozart made a pretty good living writing music for kings and counts and so on. In fact, don't let anyone tell you that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. There are objective standards of beauty. Preference is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I don't think John Denver is especially, I mean, he's not Bach, right? But I prefer John Denver. And I don't prefer Beyonce. There are objective standards. And by objective standards, Mozart wrote incredible music. I don't prefer Mozart because I know a lot of his music was written to titillate the sexual fantasies of the court that he was writing for, like Così fan tutte, one of his operas. So that's where the money really was, sort of in the later Renaissance. Science, well, a lot of the people on that slide that I had up there were clergy, which early on, of course, meant the church, the one church. But they were the only people that had the leisure to think and to do the experiments. So although there is a link there, I don't think it's a cause-effect. It's a correlation, not a causation.